Welcome, welcome, welcome to one of the big highlights of IAMAS 2021. Our theme this year is building racial equity in and across motherhood. But the MOMA Award is also something that we will be continuing throughout the years. We had our first MOMA Award last year. This is our second, but with our second award, we had a 300% increase in applications, which we were happy about to see that the word about this award was getting out, but more so it was just amazing to see what fantastic work is coming in from various campuses around the world. And it truly was an international application pool. But why I add that fact is that it was fierce competition this year in terms of so many just great work, great applications coming in. And so I think that speaks very much to the two people that are with us today, which is Ruth Candlish and Belen Amil. I'm going to talk very quickly about the purpose of the award and give a quick introduction of the two individuals with us. But after that, I will be handing it over as quickly as I can so that you can hear directly from them and about the project that they were able to launch at their school to help promote support for mother scholars. And then if time permits, and I believe that it will, we will be opening up the chat box and Q&A features for folks who would like to ask any questions, glean insight, comment on their own institutions, seek support, whatever it may be. So as you're listening to the work that they're presenting, please think about how you would like to add in your own thoughts or questions. So Nicole, Willie, and we started this award last year, a little bit before, in part because we recognized that so many mother scholars were struggling at academic universities around the world. And with that said, we also wanted to identify the fact that there is very good work being done. And what we recognized even more this year, in part because of the influx of additional applications, was that in some cases, people are working very much hand in hand with their universities, but in other cases, that may not be quite the case. And people are working against the tide and trying to make changes that are not necessarily being supported on their campuses. So with that said, we decided to set up basically two sets of recipients being awarded. And that is those that have the MOMA Award in the traditional sense that we set it up as, which is of course Anna and Ruth. And our second place winner for that was Chris Barovic, who will be speaking tomorrow as part of our roundtable. But we also had Meredith Smith from Tulane University. Chris is from Durham University. And Meredith Smith applied with Julia Broussard, and they will also be speaking tomorrow about the work that they were doing. However, we also wanted to highlight work that maybe didn't have the impact that was initially intended, but still very much speaks to the hard work of the individuals. And so we have the Changemaker Awards, and those were awarded to Catherine Riley at Wake Forest University and Monica Casper at San Diego State University. So rounding out this group of women and individuals, we have a wealth of experiences and situations. And so I hope that if you are on a campus where you're trying to affect change, that you can learn from the work and experience that they have to share with us. So today's award application winners are Ruth and Anna. Ruth Candlish is a doctoral candidate in the School of Public Policy at Central European University in Vienna and Budapest. Her research focuses on the inclusion and exclusion of disabled people in policy-making arenas. She is the founder and chair of the CEU Student Family Committee. Ruth has almost 10 years experience in the public sector, including as a senior policy officer working for the UK Foreign Office, the Cabinet Office, the Scottish Government, and city governments. She is also a senior elected trade union officer and ran a national union branch. Ruth holds a diploma in employment law from College of Northeast London, a master's in science and public administration from the University of Leiden, a master's in nationalism studies at Central European University, and a BA in anthropology and politics from the University of Edinburgh. Belen Amil is a gender equality officer at Central European University for the EU-funded project called SUPERA, which is supporting the promotion of equality in research and academia. She is responsible for the design, implementation, and monitoring of CEU's first gender equity plan, which aims at diagnosing and correcting gender imbalances in the institution across all constituencies and hierarchical levels. She is also involved in another EU-funded project, GE Academy, that develops and implements a high-quality capacity building program on gender equality in research, innovation, and higher education, and is trained as a clinical psychologist from the University of Buenos Aires and holds an Erasmus Mundus master's degree in women and gender studies. And so with no further ado on my side, I'm handing this over to Ruth and Anna, but please, as you're listening to the work that they are presenting, consider questions and comments that you may want to add at the end.
Okay, thanks, Katie. I'm just going to share my screen now. Share it here and okay. Can everyone see this okay? Okay.
I can see it perfectly.
Okay, thanks. So Anna and I are going to spend maybe sort of half an hour or so talking about some of the work we've done over the last year and a half to get more support for student parents at our home institution, which is Central European University. Just to kind of give you an idea of what we're going to be talking about, we'll introduce ourselves. Katie's covered a lot of that, but we'll maybe add a few extra things. And then Anna's going to talk about the university and the context that we work in. I'll talk a bit more about junior mother scholars and some of the policies that we managed to get put in place, and then try and remember some of the steps that we took to get there. There was a lot, so we'll try and pull out some important ones. And then Anna's just going to briefly talk about what kind of worked for us, what didn't, what we learned along the way, and a few more reflections kind of 1 year on since we've got some of the policies in place. And then we'll close with some Q&A. So I'll just briefly introduce myself. Yeah, as Katie mentioned, I am a PhD candidate in public policy. I think really the only other things to flesh out here is really I previously was a trade union officer, and this meant I had training in kind of workplace advocacy and maternity rights, which proved pretty useful throughout our campaign. I'd also worked as a government policy officer, so I had experience drafting legislation and going through the ropes of kind of getting something from an idea to a policy. And I also had 2 kids during my PhD, which is still very much ongoing. So I had my first child in my first year and my second one in my 4th year, I think. And now I'll hand to Anna to introduce herself and take over.
Thank you, Ruth. Just want to mention that Ruth is our actual absolute star here of this work. I was just there to give the framework of SUPERA into this project. Besides what has been already said about me, I was also a former member of the executive committee of the CEU trade union, and the baby in the picture is not actually mine. I just borrowed him for the purpose of the picture, but that's pretty much all that I will say about myself. So Ruth, shall we start a bit with the next slide? Wanted to share with you our context because it's a very particular one. Central European University is a very small private undergrad and graduate university, which is research focused in social sciences and humanities mostly. We didn't have undergraduate degrees until I think it was until last year. And most students here get tuition waivers, some partial or full scholarships. It's based on the principle of open society, and it was funded in 1991 by George Soros, with the mission of promoting open society in the context of the dissolution of the USSR. It's an Euro-American university. It's both accredited in the US, in Hungary, and now in Austria. It's a highly international university. It's the second most international university in the world. We have students from 117 countries and alumni in 133. But we are a college in exile. Last couple of years ago, following a very arbitrary change in Hungarian's law of higher education in 2017, Central European University was forced to relocate most of its programs from Budapest to Vienna. Later on, the European Commission of Justice declared this law, which is now known as Lex CEU, as a law that is violating the right to academic freedom in Europe. But it's a very distinctive context that is the, I believe, if not the first, but the second university that was forced to move countries in Europe due to political reasons. Next slide, please. Just to briefly introduce you the Supera project, it's the acronym for supporting the promotion of equality in research and academia. It's a 4-year collaborative project starting in 2018 and finishing next year that is funded under the European Commission Horizon 2020 program. And CEU is part of this network of universities, which aim is to develop and implement a gender equality plan, it's referred as JEPs, in research and higher education institutions. These JEPs aim to address and correct gender inequalities, stereotypes, and biases found in the respective institutions of the consortium. We are 4 research performing organizations, among them CEU, and 2 research funding organizations. And now I give the word to Ruth again.
Okay, so I just want to talk a bit about whose issues we were concerned with and where it all came into being. So when we say junior mother scholars, we were actually thinking about students, kind of all students from, obviously in the past, we didn't have the BA program, but now we do. So it was not just kind of PhD students, but also MA students and students involved in the access program. Sorry, my headphone wasn't down. So we were trying to think actually about what are some of the barriers. So we know that it's difficult for mothers with kids to go back into academia as a student. So that was kind of one thing we were thinking out. But also it was hard for students and junior academics and often PhDs to become mothers. And some of these issues, we wanted to recognize these difficulties and put in place some support around it. And some of the major barriers actually being that people weren't necessarily acknowledging that students are also parents and students become parents. There was also the idea that parenthood and especially motherhood is incompatible with being a student, which I think is very ingrained into a lot of the academia. And of course, the issue around funding, given that you're offering in a more kind of financially precarious position as a student. So how do you manage some of these costs? So these barriers were kind of more highlighted in our kind of European context, because within Europe, all employees, obviously very in contrast to the US, employees have the right to paid parental leave. And there's other protections whilst you're pregnant and things like this. This is kind of even more, so there's a big gap between students who are not employees and the rest of academia who are mostly employees at CEU. And this is even more heightened in the context of Hungary and now Austria. So you can see on the little map down here, they have some of the longest paid maternity leave. These are the 2 countries in the hoop in the EU. So this real kind of contrast actually about what students are entitled to. And again, it kind of even more complicated at CEU because we're working within these 2 national contexts and what people are entitled to in the different spaces, and we're kind of shifting between them. So, and there's a few other things that were kind of complicating things for students around. Hungary is quite restrictive about the way that state benefits are only given to EU citizens. Parental leave and benefits are restricted to cis and hetero families. So there's a lot of ways that students were not getting any support whatsoever. Now, I just want to talk a bit more about student parents at CEU also. So who are the student parents in our community? And they may differ from your home institutions. Like Anna said, as we're the #2 international university, we probably have a lot more international kind of student parent body than a lot of places. So in every given year, there's about kind of 50 to 100 student parents, and about 2/3 of those are international. The PhD community, we think, based on our kind of own surveys, it's about 15% of PhDs and parents. So that's 1 in 6 of all PhDs have kids, most of whom aren't living in their home country. So you can see CU, our university, is the main source of institutional and financial support. So when that support falls away, if you become pregnant or you need to take parental leave, you become very exposed. So in addition to that, some of the kind of issues that we were having, and these are probably shared also with grad students at your institution, and also kind of filter out into actually wider academia. Things around funding childcare, kind of financial worries, not having family-friendly scheduling of things. You know, lots of things, classes in the evenings. A lot of PhD classes were in the evenings, and that quite difficult, particularly as, for example, childcare in Hungary ends a lot earlier, and it doesn't start till age 1 often. So there's all these things coming together. Parents were also missing opportunities, like going on research days, attending conferences, and just generally a kind of lack of support and a lack of a clear picture to support. But out of all of this, we focused on 2 issues, and these both had a disproportionate effect on mother scholars. And this was paid leave for pregnant students and paid leave following birth, and improved funds for student parents. So I should also say this is a thank you to one of our student parents for giving us a picture of a very cute baby in a CU baby grow. So now I just want to briefly talk about what existed before, what's after, and then we'll sort of compare some of the things that we managed to change and address. So CU already had some limited support in place, but it was mostly quite ad hoc and informal. Sometimes it was inadequate. In case of if you gave birth, you ended up taking unpaid leave. So we went from this system of kind of patchy supports that didn't actually provide the right support and left people quite exposed, to a proper structure with paid leave, with pregnancy support, and with more funding. So I've listed some of the things that the policies we implemented put in place, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about the 2 main issues we focused on. So the first issue we looked at was the kind of most immediate one that was essentially reported to us when we sat down as student parents and we talked, was CU in the past, like a lot of institutions, didn't have a specific policy on parental leave. Rather, all students were entitled to a sort of general leave of absence. You could take up to 2 years, sort of stop the clock. And you took that for when you got pregnant, or if you wanted to take leave, if you took it. And then when you came back, you'd make informal arrangements with supervisors at departments about how you'd return. So this resulted in a whole kind of plethora of issues. There wasn't necessarily any formal protections to students when they were either pregnant or after they gave birth, or even parents more widely who might have needed to take time off. There were some informal supports in place. We heard some really flexible arrangements, but we heard a lot of unflexible arrangements. And it was just so patchy, and it kind of depended on who was putting that in place. Ultimately, the only option was to take unpaid leave after you gave birth if you needed to take period leave. So this leave of absence meant that your stipend, your funding was suspended, your health insurance payments by the university stopped. And this could also create some issues if you were in the process of renewing residency documents and things like this, which we've experienced is a lot more acute even in Vienna. So ultimately, students were taking very short or no leave after birth. And this we know well to have like a long-lasting impact on both the students themselves, on their children, on their studies. It's kind of keeps piling forward. And the mothers were most affected. So more women were taking unpaid leave, whereas men often went unofficially part-time following the birth of a child, or if they needed to fill kind of childcare gaps in the summer. We were seeing 2 kind of very different approaches here. And not only was the unpaid leave disrupting somebody's studies, but actually it meant people were having to return back to their home country, or they were relying on family or their partner. They were having to take on extra jobs when they were heavily pregnant or not long after giving birth, or ultimately people were dropping out or adding years onto how long it would take them to complete their degree. And their lives were quite disrupted. So So what we created, and this slide basically encapsulates the first policy. We had 2 different policy documents, and we'll talk more about how we're happy to share them, and you can have a look at them if that would be helpful later. But the first policy, and this took us a lot of time to kind of put together. We put first in place, we put some of the changes to regulations, things like this, and then we had a big comprehensive policy document. And this was a system to help students when they're pregnant, whether or not they continued that pregnancy, to help them after birth, adoption, or if their partner gave birth, and also if they needed time off because their child was ill, because they had gaps in childcare. Both in Hungary and Austria, childcare closes, like I believe in the US and lots of other countries, for long periods in the summer. So you might need to take that additional leave, and you don't want that to take away from the allowance that's given to everybody else. But more importantly, it shouldn't be unpaid. So some of the things that we put in place was, first thing was this idea of a support system during pregnancy. So the fact that you can have time off to go to appointments, that students have a right to confidentiality and staff are trained in how to manage that information, and there may be support with finances if needed. The big chunk was the parental leave. So all students from BA to PhD, including in additional programs, are entitled to 6 months after birth or adoption, or 1 month if it's your partner that gave birth. And that leave is paid. That means your stipend continues at 100% of what it was before. And if you don't get a stipend, then there's a system where you can apply for funds. Health insurance continues to be paid by the university, and quite importantly as well, students remain enrolled. So your immigration status is protected. We also got this additional 1 year's unpaid parental leave to cover some of these gaps. So you're not taken from that 2-year pod. Yeah, the last thing I'll just briefly touch on, part of this policy was we didn't want to just put in place these kind of supports. We also wanted a system around them that linked them all together. So the policy sets out a single point of contact, a primary contact person for each student. And that's basically one person who's a head of program or head of department who gets training in how the policy works, in how to manage confidential information. And they help the student manage their studies during pregnancy or parental leave. And impartial advice for that person comes from both Anna as our gender equality officer and our equal opportunity officer as well. The second big issue that we looked at was the student family support scheme, which had been around for about 3 years when we started looking at it. This was something that was set up as a means tested grant, essentially for students with children, that kind of topped up the state support. However, there'd been a lot of issues with how it had actually been implemented, and some of this Supera's work was particularly useful because they did a lot of review of how some of these things were working, and we found it was very bureaucratic. It took a long time to get money, but students were telling us, actually, the first few months when I have a kid or when I move to Budapest or Vienna, that's the most expensive, because often you needed official documents before you got the money. And then we had a disparity here because for non-EU students, it took longer to get those documents, to get official residency passes, permits and things like that. So they had to wait longer. Mature student parents were missing out because it was capped at 14. And there was this 3-year gap. So most PhDs take 6 years, but the support basically said it only goes for the first 3 years if you're PhD. But as we all know, children definitely don't disappear after 3 years. So we needed that kind of continued support. So our second policy that we got put in place was, I've said new policy, but really it was a revised policy. And it was not only, as Anna and I well know, we didn't just revise it once or twice to get to this final scheme. We cycled through, I think, maybe 3 or 4 different models and costed them up and tried to figure them out and negotiated them with the staff and admin to figure out what would work and what would kind of get the maximum impact. In the end, we ended up with possibly the most kind of simplest and straight line scheme, where every student's entitled to a monthly grant, and it's not tied to state benefits. It's just paid by the university. If you live in one of the 2 campuses and your child accompanies you, you can apply for this. It continues throughout the whole of your studies. So if you go on fieldwork, or if you take birth leave, or if you study abroad under a CEU program, you can still continue to get that. the scheme is opened up as well. So it meant that step parents or guardians or parents in different family arrangements are now able to apply if they can show that they have a parenting relationship with a child. We also opened it up to non-degree students, including the Roma Access Programme, which is an important part of CU's student body as well. And the funding went up to age 18. One of the important things that actually we worked on in the scheme was the application process. And this was actually blocking a lot of people from applying and creating a lot of financial difficulties for people. So now applications are online. There is alternative evidence. If you can't get that official residence permit straight away, there's alternative things you can put in pending that. That means you're going to get your money quicker. And we gave more control to students around how and what amount of payments they get. Essentially, you're entitled to an annual lump amount. And if you want it to be front loaded, you can ask for that. So you can help manage some of the finances there. Now, I've just got a couple of slides where I'm going to talk about some of the steps we took to get all of these, to get basically from the old to the new. And then Anna will talk about some of our lessons learned from these steps. So basically, this is how I recall some of the steps that we went through. It doesn't necessarily have to be in this order. It's not a game of snakes and ladders, or maybe more, it is a game of snakes and ladders where we went up and down and along things. It's just, this is how it panned out for us, and we're doing different bits at different times. But just to give a sense of some of the things we did. The first sort of cluster of steps we did was essentially, we sat down and as a group of student parents, we talked amongst ourselves in a more organized way. We were having some of these conversations anyway. I was fortunate that I was within a particular part of the university where there was quite a number of student parents. So I knew other people in a similar position. And we linked in some others as well. So we went from, I think our first meeting, we had 6 students and a baby, of course, and now we're a much larger network that not only includes student parents, but kind of wider supporters who are interested in gender equality as well. And we reached out initially through word of mouth, and then we built a mailing list and now kind of do more things on Facebook and the different channels. One of the things that helped us hugely was we formalized ourselves as a committee. So we were quite fortunate in that we could piggyback on an existing successful advocacy group for PhDs. The previous couple of years, there'd been a group of volunteers called the PhD Working Group, who had managed to get some successful policies passed. And we became a subcommittee of them, and some of their reputation and their solid reputation helped us get a listening with senior leaders and things like this. And I'll also talk a bit more about some of the help later there. And then we went and we sat down together and we mapped out what are the issues. We just kind of asked everybody, what are the things you're struggling with? Some of the things I've mentioned before. And then we sat down and we prioritized them. So, and tried to think about actually, what are the most significant things going forward? What things can we push? And one of the things we did experience was that people did have different ideas about what is the most important issue, but ultimately, and I think this is something that I learned from some of the union education I did, we advocated for the issues that cause the most structural inequalities. We started with the big things first that were really, really massively affected. And then later on, we've continued to pick off some of the other things. The next sort of set of steps was we sat down and we prepared what we wanted to ask for. So once we'd figured out our issues, we started to prepare this ask. We talked to people who changed policy, and this is where Anna was a huge, huge help because she's passed through many policies recently through our University Academic Forum in the Senate, gone through all the kind of steps. So Anna gave us huge amounts of support in telling us how you change policy, what kind of approach you can do. We also talked to Jackie, who was the chair of the PhD working group, who changed and made changes for PhD policies. And she helped us figure out how we can pitch things and how we can put this together. Building on some of this advice, one of the first things we did was we gathered data. We were quite fortunate that Supera had some good information about student parents at the university and how this linked into gender inequality. What were the numbers? What were the kind of things that were happening? And we built this in. one of the most important things we did that I think really helped us a lot was to benchmark. We looked at what other universities that our university often competes with for students and things like this, what did they offer? And we picked off the best practice. We specifically went looking for who's doing this well and what can we learn from them. So building onto that, I always say this thing is we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can just steal the wheel in that sense. We've just borrowed good solutions and we looked to places that were doing it right. But then, of course, we had to adapt those solutions to our university. So they needed to be workable. So we went and we checked them. We asked student parents, would that work for you? Is that what you actually wanted? We asked staff, does that work? You know, sometimes there were things like, well, that can't work in the Hungarian legal context. There were unintended things that we couldn't have necessarily anticipated. So it's this idea about kind of sort of co-producing some of them solutions and getting that advice in. And also getting people's ownership in the process. And the last thing is we had to be realistic about our solutions. Sometimes this was quite hard about making kind of tough decisions. So as PhD students, we get 36 months stipend. So if we'd asked for an additional third of that to get 12 months paid maternity leave, we were advised that would be very unlikely, but 6 months would be likely to get. So it was about making, I think, some difficult decisions about how we pitched things and what we realistically could achieve. And the last thing really from me is how did we go and like manage to persuade people to do this? So essentially we treated it like in the same way you treat a mini lobbying campaign if you were lobbying. I just think of the time when I used to work in the parliament and I just tried to think, how did people persuade people to get things done? So the first thing we did was really, we structured what we were asking for. We wrote, we had a one-page document, it wasn't this one page, it was a single document which detailed the asks we wanted, and we made sure that we aimed high with them. We didn't want to ask for lots of little things because then we might have ended up just with one or two little things. We asked for some big chunky policy things. We used our expertise as well. So my background working in policy and Anna's background working in gender studies, we made sure that we were checking in with each other. How would this work and how can we write this up? Yeah, and I said, as before, we kept trying to aim big. We wanted to be realistic, but we wanted actually to challenge and make sure that there were massive changes. Then we went about actually campaigning for that change. So we canvassed for support also by reminding people that, or pitching it, that this wasn't just something for student parents. It wasn't just for that 15%. This was about everybody at the university who was invested in gender equality. And we're quite fortunate that Super had set some of the tone in the pitch for that. And we went and talked to lots of different people who were interested in that. We also thought about actually who was important to connect with, who sat on the Senate and, you know, who was a head of department and things like this. And one of the things that helped us kind of raise the profile, I think, of some of our work was we did two sort of canvassing things. We did an open petition to students and alumni where we kind of set out, this is the issues, this is our asks. And that got a lot of signatures and that was circulated around through Facebook, through word of mouth and things like this. At the same time, we did a slightly different approach for faculty and staff, where we did an internal letter of support where they could sign up, and that was just within the institution. So we were looking for both wide and targeted support, and we were trying to adjust some of the channels to think how we could get those supports on the list. And then the last thing really was, once we'd got the policies in place, we made sure we stayed involved. I've seen so often that actually when things get implemented, it goes completely awry and the original intention isn't there. So we kept involved with things. We made sure that those policies had a commitment to review in it and had a commitment that students would be involved in the review. And that went a way to actually changing the culture around how you write policies together and treat each other as kind of users and get people involved in that way. And then I think the last thing was really we made sure that actually there was training and there was awareness raising. We were fortunate that our campaign had kind of raised the profile a bit of student parents at the university. But by putting in place this kind of system of communication and these primary contact people, it meant that in pretty much every department, there was somebody who was responsible and had a vested interest in representing and thinking about student parents. So I'm going to hand over to Anna now to talk about what was hard and what helped. And then I'll come back later at the end. Okay, Anna, so that's to you.
Thank you, Ruth. So as you probably already know, I'm coming from the angle of a theory of institutional change, and the obstacles and headaches are called resistances in this frame, in this theoretical frame. So I'm going to talk about what was tricky. The first thing is that might be something very obvious, but bureaucracy is slow. Even though we're in a small university, cannot even imagine what it is to work for a bigger public one. Our suggestion is to find out how policy approval processes work in your institution. In our institution, we have three stops there. One is the senior leadership team first review that is done in closed doors. Then we have an academic forum, which is public, and the Senate, which is also closed doors. You only learn about the final vote, but you don't know who voted for what. So the deadlines and preparation of the policy can take a long time. For example, for us to get things to our Senate, we had to plan 3 months ahead. The second thing to be aware is stepping on toes issues. We learned from previous efforts that it was important to include all administrative staff and faculty staff who are working on these issues from the outset. Even if we didn't always agree on the goal, but early inclusion and looping people in really prevented any feeling of stepping on toes or professional jealousies, which are very common in all institutions. Also remember that parents are busy people. It takes a long time sometimes to get feedback from them. So support from others as you all parents coming in. But mobilizing students is the only way of moving this forward, since it will rarely be a top-down institutional priority to enhance student parents, student maternity and paternity rights. So always realize that this is going to be most likely a something coming from grassroots rather than top-down. Best laid plans can also come undone, so have a plan B and a plan C. Be ready to negotiate. Our solutions were not always accepted. We had to replan the Student Child Support Fund, maybe it took us 4 iterations, each time modeling and checking with students' parents over and over again. And I do remember that our parental policy also took a couple of iterations because of the number of months that we were asking for partner leave that was not granted at first, so we had to tweak there. And another obvious one, but also important, summer is a bad time. I come from the other hemisphere in which summer is in January, but in the case of above the Ecuador, then August, late July and August is a really bad time. Things get lost, people lose interest or forget about the issue. Next slide, please, Ruth. Okay, so we're talking now about supports. Once the slide, it doesn't matter. Here we are, okay. So what was helpful in our strategy? So we wrote here, business arguments matters. I want to expand a little bit on this. It's not only about business arguments, but senior leaders, so those with decision-making capacity, want to hear business arguments before the equality and academic arguments. So many times business comes first. So what does this make financial and reputational sense. So sometimes it's not only about the money, but also about how the university is going to look like vis-a-vis the rest of the higher education institutions in the region. So the discursive alignment between your goals, so what you're trying to advocate for, and the goals from the university is called strategic framing in process of institutional change, and it's a very important thing to pay attention to. In our case, CEU takes a lot of pride for being a very progressive institution, and we just moved to Austria, in which gender equality is, of course, much more advanced than in Hungary. So it's important for CEU not to be basically not to be the last one on the list in terms of gender equality. So this was very helpful for our arguments. People matter, target potential allies in strategic places, those people sitting on the Senate or any other decision-making body that you have in your university. The department heads generally have quite a lot of power. Fellow parent scholars are also a good place to start. Mass emails work for petitions, but personalized emails help garner interest and impetus. And sometimes you cannot even send mass emails because of policy of the university. Make it official. Any formal sounding backing helps. We got the student union to pass a support motion, included a student parent objective in the gender equality plan under the Supera framework. So we had an entire section dedicated to this. And one important thing, make senior leadership sign. One of our biggest help was that we had was that we got to the Senate, we managed the Senate to formally agree on a roadmap for change. So they first agree on a couple of changes, but they also agree on a roadmap for further changes. So this meant that anytime we got slowed down, we could refer to this document that had been already signed. So always go with a paper and pen. Crowdsource advice. We mailed every draft solution and policy to the entire student family committee. So 50+ parents were reading and spotting all the unexpected points that were being overlooked. Ask your experts. We consulted with the student life office, medical staff, immigration office, and also other internal expertise in our university, and also get a rough cost for the implementation of the policy. So they are going to ask, okay, how much this is going to cost our university. Always remember that good and done is better than perfect. Policy is always a process. It doesn't happen once, and it's better to have a framework you can amend later than spend years and years perfecting a policy. Important to build in a commitment to review and revise the policy in the policy itself. So just right there, a clause that says this policy will be revised in 2 years to see how it works. Next slide, please. 1 year on from the passing of this policy, childcare related leave tripled in a year. We had now 15 students that had taken leave under the new policy. 13 were birth leave, 3 were parental leave, and 2 parental leave. Previously, 3 to 5 students per year took leave for childcare. All new mothers now have taken the full 6 months paid leave. 30 students, 50 children getting child support, which is, yeah, you get almost 50 kids in the university receiving this very generous student child support that we have now in place compared to last year. And another item on the uptake, regular awareness raising has begun. Ruth already mentioned this, but now we have 17 heads of departments and programs attending a first training on how this policy works. Not because the policy is so complex, it's because people don't tend to read policy, so it's always better to have them 15 minutes in a room and talk them through about it. Some reflections on this last year. We had, or we're hoping for a culture shift, recognizing students as mothers, but motherhood is not yet a valued part of the academic life. So there's a lot of work yet to be done. The community now it's including students in CEU parent networks, linking PhD with faculty mothers who can also mentor and give advice. And we have also a very important matter issue in terms of ration inequality. We have a quite big Roma graduating program, and support for Roma and refugee parents is an important plank in our policy changes. Our refugee education moved to Berlin, but nevertheless, it's a big part of the work that we do in this policy. But there's of course more room for things to be done, especially now that we're in Austria and we can bring these people back. What's next? One is to improve the study abroad opportunities to promote student-parent take-up. So basically, this is that students that want to go studying abroad who are parents can actually do it because they have financial support for this. The second one is to get a subsidized on-site kindergarten, which is proving to be much more complex than it looked at first glance. So it might take us even a couple of years. And the third big thing is to level up the employee leave. So every partner at CEU gets 1 month paid leave, which by law they don't get neither in Austria nor in Hungary. So I think the next slide, that is basically on resources. So email Ruth if you would like to access any of these resources that we use in our campaign, policy briefs, policy documents, research papers, and the likes. And email me if you want to know more about Supera, about gender equality at CEU, and in general about institutional transformation in gender equality towards gender equality, of course. Ruth listed other resources there. Ruth, would you like to mention them?
So these are just a few of the key things that we found some good practices in, and particularly if you were in the European context, there's really good pieces of information about who does what and what you're entitled to here. But we have a lot more. So, and I also have quite a few from North America as well. So if you're interested in anything about graduate student maternity leave, you can just email me and I'm happy to share things that I have. And then I will just close us off now. So let me just, okay, so we're just going to close with a photo that kind of demonstrates how Anna and I often felt many days, like we were going into battle with a wooden sword. It was long, it was hard. We did a lot of unpaid labor. Yeah, so I think we'd like to thank Katie and IAMAS for giving us this recognition around this award, but also for highlighting the fact that it is really important that student parents are getting that support. I think one of the arguments we made from the very outset was, you know, students often don't feel they're entitled, particularly PhD students, to the same rights as employees, but it is an important part of actually the academic career pipeline, isn't it? So to have some of that support and that challenge some of those inequalities from very early on means that we're not only diversifying the kind of student body, but you're also supporting people who want to go on and become mothers at different points in their careers. And I think, yeah, but we've got a lot more things to do. So that would be it really from us. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And then I've seen there was some questions in the Q&A, I think, as well. So. Right, and I will just invite Katie to come back. So.
Here I am. Wonderful that we have questions already. Thank you both, Ruth and Anna. That was so informative and inspiring to hear about the work that you did. It sounds, the way that you broke it down was of course very understandable and made it seem very practical and, dare I say, easy, but I am positive that this was not easy in any way, shape, or form. And so the fact that you were both able to accomplish this on top of so many other responsibilities that you have professionally and personally, again, I'm just grateful that we were able to recognize the hard work that you've been able to do and support of mother scholars more generally. And I'm sure that what you've done will be a terrific example for other people. But we have a question from Esther. Ruth, thanks for offering the opportunity to take a look at some of your policy docs. We'd love to get more information on how to receive or access them. I think that was perhaps what you covered in the very last slide, but as if there's anything you'd like to add to that.
I think I just say if anybody wants to email me, even if you just don't want the documents, but just interested in doing something at your in an institution, I'm more than happy to chat about that or anything. So,
okay. Big cheer for Ruth and Anna from another CEU PhD mama. When I started my PhD at CEU, none of this existed, not even the quote unquote old policies, and it took years to gain visibility for student parents. This initiative made such a difference, but it was a bumpy process, I think, and Ruth deserves more recognition and remuneration for all the time she put into this. I certainly echo that as well. And I don't feel that our award even comes close to the recognition that you deserve, but we are very glad that we were able to extend that to you and recognize the work that you've been doing. So Catherine writes, have they or are they planning on publishing about this process in an article or a book chapter? Oh,
I can respond to that. No, we haven't necessarily discussed that, but I know that I have seen some publications on where people have gone through institutional change. But if anybody had any advice for us on how we might go about doing that, I think we'd be when we come up to breathe, we might be. I am currently actually on the maternity leave at the moment myself. Yeah, we'd maybe consider that. So if anybody has any advice, we'd do drop us an email as well. We'd be very keen on that. Yeah.
Are there other questions or comments? So one of the things that I had a question about is, and this alludes a little bit to the first question that was asked, is that certainly, like say, publicly traded companies usually have very public policies about, whether it's maternity leave or different things like that. I have found in some of our research, because as we build out this program, we're hoping to develop a top 100 universities list similar to US magazine or Working Mother magazine in the United States has a list so that mothers that are looking for places that support their care work can find a place that matches and aligns with those priorities. So I have found, and I know that you mentioned that document earlier, but do you feel like there's kind of consistency in terms of what universities are sharing in terms of transparency? And do you think that that's information? Are there more laws or sort of even norms around that in the EU?
So I think it depends. In quite a number of countries in the EU, like in Germany and to an extent in Austria, students are employees, so they get protected by the EU framework. So that's often very well known. I actually found it quite difficult for a lot of universities, even ones that had reasonable policies, they were hidden away. It was almost like it wasn't a selling point. It wasn't something to be kind of cheered about. They were hidden in some kind of student regulation guidelines somewhere that I was like, on page 7, and I would find, oh, they give 4 months of paid leave. But it was, yeah. So it was kind of a bit of a patchwork. I think in some of the EU countries, it was quite clear what is available, and the EU just kind of ranks the different countries on what they give. But a lot of countries, I also think there was an assumption, particularly within the EU context, that you're a PhD student, well, you're kind of employed. You do some contract work, you'll be fine. You'll get protected. And that I think was the case also for our university a lot in Hungary, that the assumption was, well, Hungary gives almost 2 years not fully paid maternity leave. What's the problem? When actually there was this huge stark contrast that when you went to give birth, you lost your health insurance, you lost all of these things, and yet everybody around you is getting 2 years of paid leave. So yeah, but generally I think it was harder to find even good policies, which seems a little odd, but I think that says some of the attitude towards how we're thinking about students as parents or not just not even thinking that that's an important kind of plank in attracting different students. So yeah.
And that was something that we had talked about recently. We ran a Voices, Visions, and Advocacy two-part series addressing graduate student mother scholars. And we talked about the ways that historically academia just simply didn't include women really as part of the quote unquote ideal student. And that can go over hundreds of years. And despite the fact that women have been in academia for decades, if much longer, in fact, there's still this resistance to consider that aspect. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how we can change those norms around women in academia more largely, but particularly mothers and parents as being part of that conversation.
Do you want to take that one, Anna?
That's a tough one. I can say something. So I can say two things besides absolutely agreeing with what you just mentioned. It's not only a matter of women not being the ideal worker in the academia, but also something that at least we encounter pretty often, and I think Ruth and I also pushed a lot, is to build this policy in the most inclusive manner. So taking into consideration that there are many types of families, not under the, say, hetero-cis format of traditional family or parenthood, because that's our next, so to speak, our next challenge as well, even though the previous one is still not yet solved. But both in Hungary and in Austria, the rights of LGBTQI+ people are not acknowledged in formal national policy. So that's something that we wanted to address in our policies. And then in general, I do deliver training on basically on work-life balance, and this the idea of the ideal worker is not only in academia. You can see it in academia, but it's not only there. That it's not actually from that long ago that the division between work done outside a home that is paid and work done inside a home that is unpaid is such a clear-cut thing. So it really actually started with the Industrial Revolution. So the idea that the home and the office are separate spheres of human functioning is actually, historically speaking, quite recent. So we are totally legitimized to question that. And also, what I always try to bring to the table is to reflect, all of us together, so the entire university community, on what is the role of the university and what is the role of higher education in the reproduction of the society and the reproduction of the stereotypes, and how does the university contribute to a better and more equal society. So what do we want to do as a university, and what part or what role do we think we have or should have in the development of a more equal society for us all. And I think that reflection is not there. It's really not there. There's no space for discussing what is the social service that the university is doing to our society, although that's redundant, but I hope I got the message across.
And I might just add one additional, I suppose, reflection on this, that I think Anna's really right. And I think maybe in the context of Hungary, the contrast between some of the kind of social conservatism of the current government, which is so kind of extreme to the extent that, you know, marriage has been redefined within the constitution as a very between man and woman and things like this. It's very aggressively anti-LGBT. That almost, to see, you had a very different position in Hungary, and it was the outlier, you know, the kind of more liberal progressive university. And I I think we've yet to see how that shifts in Austria, which is in some ways less conservative context, but in other ways there's a lot of social conservatism there. And I wonder how the university will, position itself in this. But I think, I think there's still things to be seen. But even on a kind of practical on the ground, we definitely saw some quite big differences between how student fathers were approached, were treated, how their fatherhood was reflected and commented on, which is just repeated throughout different employments and things like this. It was very much kind of acutely different for student mothers. And I think the other thing, like Anna said, is we did really want to think about about actually who else is a student parent and who's not only falling outside of state support, but actually being aggressively written out of state support, being made vulnerable because of this kind of attack on LGBTQI rights in particularly in Hungary. So this was an important consideration when we were writing those policies. We wanted to make sure that as much as possible, people were getting additional support and space there, because certainly the Hungarian state was not giving it.
Yes, very different context, correct. Yeah.
It'll be interesting then to chart particularly, and I'm so glad that you have that within the work that you're doing, saying that we want to have these checks and evaluations to be done. I'm sure that will help, of course, sustain the project and make sure that it carries the weight that it's intended to, but also be able to provide the information that so many other universities need to justify including these programs, which is oftentimes, unfortunately, a case that still needs to be made.
Yeah.
So you've certainly, I think, oh, sorry, Ruth, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if there's one thing that I think we found was really important was put in a commitment to uprate anything financial, because so often it just kind of rolls over. And this is what I learned also working in Parliament and things like this is, if somebody has to review the amount given of any kind of fund or anything like this, if it's built into the policy, they just have to do it. Otherwise, you have to lobby every 2 years when things go up. It's a lot of work. So and if that's the only review system that goes in, it's make sure the money gets reviewed. Otherwise, you'll spend 6 years on that level, and whilst everything's gone up. So that's all.
Well, thank you again, Anna and Ruth. I feel like I could talk to you all afternoon, and I know that so many people are going to be inspired by your advice, and you've, I think, helped pave the path, make it a little bit smoother for folks that are trying to enact this sort of change on their campuses around the world. Clearly, policies are divergent, and there's still a lot of work that's being done to increase support from other scholars. But I am so grateful that you were able to share with us your experience and your wisdom today. So thank you very much. Again, we mentioned that there will be other speakers addressing these issues tomorrow, and we encourage you to join the MOMA roundtable, because there is, of course, many other ideas and experiences to share that we can all learn from. But for today, thank you very much. And again, I hope everybody found this as informative and useful as I did. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. If anything, I would like everybody to take out from this is just, at least for me, encourage universities to think, who are universities for? Thank you very much for having us here.
An excellent closing thought. Thank you, Anna.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.